Hello everybody, it's Dr. Elam again, here for the Week 2 overview. So our literary texts this week are selections from Dante's Inferno and the Old English poem, The Dream of the Rood. So let me start with an overview of The Dream of the Rood. It's an Old English poem from the Anglo-Saxon culture. So I'm a medievalist. This is in my area of medieval literary study. And technically there's a distinction between Anglo-Saxon and Old English that has emerged over the past few decades. Usually when we talk about Old English, we are talking about the language of the Anglo-Saxon people and the poetry and literature written in that language. And when we talk about Anglo-Saxon, we're usually talking about the culture whose language was Old English. Now, if you look at writing from, maybe up until the 1960s, 50s, or 60s, the terms are used interchangeably. So if you do some background research into it, the terms are often interchangeable. But for us, I typically make that distinction, that technical distinction. So The Dream of the Rood is written in alliterative verse, which creates the poetic effect on the letter sounds in words. Our translation, I don't remember, I'm embarrassed to say. So I've translated The Dream of the Rood, but I don't remember if the translation, those who put together the course material, alliterates or not. In any case, whether it alliterates or not, one of the major focal points in The Dream of the Rood is the presentation of what's known as the Christus Victor model of redemption. So we're not doing theology or Bible study in this class, but for our purposes, the Christus Victor, namely the conquering Christ, is a view that Christ in his crucifixion actually is exercising his power, that he is conquering the grave and death in his crucifixion. It's very active. Some have pointed out that maybe Germanic tribes, and the Anglo-Saxons would be included in that, maybe Germanic tribes would have objected to this passive Christ who gets himself killed, gets himself crucified on the cross. I've even heard objections like that in the modern era. Well, Christians often looked at that or saw that objection and then recognized something in Christ's sacrifice that wasn't exactly passive. So there is a passive component. In fact, the passion of the Christ turns on God allowing himself in the second person of the Trinity to have things done to him, right? To suffer. Nevertheless, in that suffering is still God in control of the situation. Some of your denominations may use words like sovereignly controlling, or God's sovereignty, God's unconquerable will being carried out in the crucifixion. That's the emphasis in Dream of the Rood. Now, the strange thing about Dream of the Rood is not that it's a dream vision. That was very common in the Middle Ages. But the strange thing for us, I suppose. The strange thing would be the speaker in the dream is the cross. So the cross is telling this story to the dreamer, and the cross, the instrument of death, is reflecting in a way that could be paradigmatic would be a fancy way of saying model, right? Could be presenting a model for thinking about the crucifixion of Christ. When I've taught this poem in medieval English literature, many of my students are nervous about what they see in it as a kind of what they see as idolatry, right? The cross is saying, pray to me. The dreamer seems to be encouraging his reader to pray to the cross. So we need to understand whatever we think about that, and however modern people have characterized that. For the medieval poet, he does not see that as worship, as a worshipful act. Now, I know some of you, even myself in the past, would have said, well, by default, whether they intended it or not, they are worshiping. We're not going to settle that question here. I just want you to know that the poet doesn't intend that. That's not what the poet means. The poet is heavily influenced by this mediator model of the world. C.S. Lewis talks about this in his Discarded Image, his introduction to medieval and Renaissance literature. So there is a great emphasis on mediation, intermediaries. They would see the second person of the Trinity as kind of like the ultimate expression of that, and from that we can infer that the mediation model is a big deal in primary experience. Now, again, I don't necessarily think that way myself, and perhaps some of you don't think that way either. I do have colleagues who do think that way, Christian brothers and sisters who think that way. For better or for worse, that's how the poet is thinking about it. So ultimately, his goal is to get the reader to focus on Christ. Christ, the young man who isn't nailed to the cross by others, but who walks up to the cross and climbs up onto the cross. And the cross uses imagery about Christ hanging on to him, embracing him. That is an active Jesus who has control over the entire situation. The cross also acknowledges that Jesus' disciples and followers are upset by this, right? There's something distressing in the crucifixion of Christ. But from that, the cross points out ultimately to Christ's victory. So that's my overview of Dream of the Rood. Let's transition now to Dante and the Divine Comedy. So the Divine Comedy is broken into three parts. The Inferno is the first part, which is Dante's recognition about the depravity of sin. Sin in its fullness. And when Dante goes through the Inferno, one might ask, Dante doesn't ask this in the Inferno, but one might ask, well, if sin is so bad, what is a person to do about that? If sin is so damning and you cannot escape from hell, then what is the believer to do about sin? That introduces the next part of the poem, the Purgatorio. Now, I'm in the Reformed tradition, and we do not affirm the existence of a real purgatory, but we do think about sanctification. And I'm not trying to say that this is how Dante was thinking about it. Dante did believe in a literal purgatory, although he probably didn't think of it as a mountain like Mount Purgatory in his poem. Hang on, my phone is ringing. Let me pause. I'll get right back to you. All right, sorry for that interruption. So he didn't think about the purgatory as literally a mountain, but he did believe in that place. And so the Purgatorio, which we're not reading for this class, is Dante's exploration about the believer overcoming the chains of sin, going through a sanctification process in which God allows the elect to participate. From there, we get to the third part of the Divine Comedy, which is the Paradiso. And in the Paradiso, Dante imagines himself rising through the physical universe, which becomes a tapestry for the dead in Christ, the saints, to appear to him as projections. And they do say to Dante in the poem, they say, we're not really here, we're actually in the presence of God, but we are being projected here for your benefit. And then the physical layout of the universe, as the medieval saw it, which was geocentric, the earth was in the center of the universe. The physical layout of the universe becomes a way for Dante to think about matters of faith, to think about virtue in its unmixed forms, and ultimately to profess his faith, his hope, and his love in the stellatum, the sphere of the fixed stars, the next to the last sphere in the medieval scheme of the universe. He talks about his faith, hope, and love there, and anchors his answers in the scriptures. Now this brings me back to Inferno. We are only reading from Inferno. So we are only reading from the first part of the comedy, and we are only reading selections from the first part of the comedy. So be cautious. Even though you're getting snippets from it, it does not give the overall sense of what Dante is doing in the comedy, but it does give you some ideas about the kinds of things, the kinds of ways he's working it out. So at the beginning of the comedy, the very first line, Dante expresses or talks about being halfway through man's journey. And that is a reference to the Psalms, where the psalmist says, the span of a man's life is 70 years, 80 if he has strength. Now, Dante lived in the real world and knew that people sometimes didn't make it to 70 or 80. Sometimes they lived past 80 years old. So he's not reducing a biological fact, or he's not reducing scriptures to expressing a biological or primary reality fact. What he's doing is he's signaling to us, the reader, at 35 years old, in the year 1300, Dante was born in 1265, in the year 1300, I was lost in a dark wood, and I was 35. That's halfway through life's journey. According to the Psalms, I am anchoring my meditations in the scriptures. We may not like what he's doing in the scriptures. We are in his exploration of the scriptures, his interpretation of the scriptures. But for Dante, whatever we may think, he does see himself as focused on scriptural truth. Now, yes, he believes in purgatory. Yes, he believes in the church hierarchy, which is why he's so disgusted with the papacy, because he sees the office of the Pope as a legitimate office being corrupted by men like Nicholas III, Boniface VIII, who he's got a real beef against, Gregory, I think it's Gregory V or something like that. Some of the popes that that are mentioned as being in hell, right? He meets Pope Nicholas III in hell, being tortured in there. So Dante is, maybe he's kind of proto-reformational. He's not in the camps of Calvin and Luther and other Reformation figures totally, but he still recognizes some corruption in the church that he's very upset about. As he goes through the Purgatorio, he witnesses the punishment of sin. Mark Musa, in his translation of Inferno, which is the translation we've selected, and we selected it because it's easier to read than some other translations. And by the way, it's a very good translation. If you read his translator's note, you understand that Musa is very sensitive to Dante's language. So his medieval Italian language. So Dante is witnessing sin. He uses a word down in the 8th circle of the Inferno in the ditch. The 8th circle is divided into 10 ditches, or Malabolgia. So in one of the ditches in the 8th circle, the ditch of the soothsayers, I don't remember which ditch it is, but one of the soothsayers says, "In me you see the perfect counter-suffering." And the Italian word is contrapasso, counter-suffering. And that has become a way of understanding the sins in the Inferno. So I think that is a helpful way of understanding the sins, but I don't think it's complete. I actually think that we have to pay attention to what Dante hears in the 3rd circle of the Inferno also. And in the 3rd circle, which is the circle of the gluttons, we get the idea expressed that I'm here, the sinner who's talking is saying, I'm here getting what I want. This is what I want for all of eternity. I have the full realization of my sin. So contrapasso, right, there's a sin and a puzzle piece punishment that goes on to it, I think is okay. There's nothing wrong with that. But I don't think it's quite complete. It is in the realization of sin that the damned experience their punishment. Remarkably enough, nobody in the Inferno asks to leave. Dante does not believe that people can go from Inferno to Purgatorio and then to heaven, right? He doesn't believe that. Inferno is for the damned, and there's no hope of getting out. The first 9 lines of Canto 3 close that door. So Dante sees these sins being committed. Musa, our translator, he also sees Dante as committing some of the sins that he witnesses in each of the circles. I'm hard-pressed to see it in every single circle, but there are places where Dante does commit the sin being punished. For example, in the 9th circle, he tells one of the sinners, yes, I promise that if you tell me your story, I will clear the ice away from your eyes and your face. And then after the story is told, Dante says explicitly, and I didn't keep the promise, and I was happy not to keep the promise. I'm paraphrasing, of course. So the implication is that Dante himself is in danger of hell. He needs to have a revelation of the ugliness of sin in order to begin the process of being spurred on to righteousness. And think about this too. And Dante does point out that the Inferno is not the same thing as eternal damnation, right? A few of the sinners will say, this is where we are until Christ comes back, and then after that, Christ will judge all people, and we will be cast into perdition along with the rebellious angels. So his Inferno is kind of like a holding place. So those punishments there are literary. These are Dante's imaginations, and they're terrible. It's like a horror movie. Think about this, though. Perhaps hell is worse than Dante can imagine. Perhaps all of the nastiness that he presents cannot encapsulate, cannot capture what hell is really like. It's something that I believe Dante wants to use to spur his readers on to seek the Lord and to seek the Lord's forgiveness. So that is one of the important facets of Dante's journey in the Inferno section. In any case, that's my overview of Inferno. As we did in week 1, and as we will do in all of the weeks where we have dialogue assignments, the dialogue assignment will be for you to pose a question to me, a good faith question, legitimate question to which you don't know the answer, about our primary literary reading. So Dream of the Rood or Inferno, right? You don't have to ask me questions about both of them. It could be one or the other. So post those by Wednesday. Remember, for this class, not for your other classes necessarily, for this class, your dialogue post needs to be posted by Wednesday, and you'll get full credit for that, and you do not need to answer anybody else. You can if you want, but there's no requirement to do so. And then later on in the week, toward the end of the week, I will give an overview, a video session answering your questions. It's a process I'm still working through. It may look exactly like I did in week 1. I may think of something new to do between now and then. I don't know. In any case, I'm glad you're here. I'm always glad you're here. I'm always glad to be studying literature. I'm especially glad to be studying classical and medieval literature. Medieval is my primary area. Classical is my secondary area. So I hope that you're delighting in it. I know it can be tedious at times, and maybe it's not everybody's cup of tea, but I hope you're giving it a chance and enjoying it nevertheless. And I will talk to you all again later on in the week. Bye-bye.